Now, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Graham Stringer. We are indeed honoured tonight to have a parliamentarian of Graham's calibre to address us. Quite frankly, if it wasn't for Graham and a small number of his parliamentary colleagues, Brexit wouldn't be happening. Hang on, Graham, I've got a few more words to say. Thank you, Graham. You've chosen not to vote with most of your parliamentary colleagues in an attempt to ensure that leave doesn't mean leave. Instead, you've remained loyal to the millions of Labour voters who came out in the referendum and secured a great victory for democracy. It was a Conservative government which first supported our membership of the European Union, and it was the then leader of the Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, who rightly believed that membership would entail the end of 1,000 years of British history. How right he was. Before entering Parliament in 1997, Graham worked as a scientist and was leader of Manchester City Council for 12 years. Under Tony Blair, he served in the Cabinet Office and has been a member of the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, where he has been a consistent critic of global warming theories. In 2014, he voted to amend the immigration bill in order to prevent foreign criminals using European human rights in deportation cases. Graham has also been an advocate for House of Lords reform. And he has described the European Union as a barrier to progressive government. How right he is. We've heard from Ruth tonight the perilous state, for instance, the Greek people have found themselves in, thanks to the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome a great Democrat and one of the most effective opponents of the European Union in the House of Commons, Graham Stringer.
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily kind introduction. I'm not sure totally deserved, but enjoyed, if not deserved. The only thing I would have dissented or disagreed from, really, was I think the time for House of Lords reform has gone. I think they have become they have become a very strong advocate for their own abolition. Yes. They are standing in the way of the democratic decision of 17.5 million people almost exactly 2 years ago, without any shame whatsoever. I advise anybody who doubts that to go and read the House of Lords Hansard, where people shamelessly stand up and say that they want to stop Brexit. They have some colleagues in the House of Commons who say exactly the same thing, and I will come on to talk about that a little later. The first question I want to ask is, and it occurs to me regularly, is how hard can it be to become an independent, self-governing country? There are some people in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords, in the political establishment, who are determined to make it as hard as possible. I'm reminded when I listen to some of the comments that those comments would have found themselves happily on the lips of jingoists in the late 19th century and British people who were worrying about the loss of empire in the 1930s, 40s and 50s in this country. Those people said that people in Africa and Asia could not rule themselves. They weren't up to it. They would make a mess of it. They weren't as intelligent as British people who were running the empire. How similar does that sound to those people who are trying to deny the right of the referendum to be carried through by our legislative assembly at the present time? Poor people didn't know what they were voting for. But people say that they didn't understand it. They weren't clever enough. They didn't know the consequences. And it comes out, I mean, the best example, the most blatant example of what has been a fundamental challenge to the centrist, centre-left, centre-right political elites that have been running much of our Western democracies at the moment, is the quote from Hillary Clinton. Many of you may know it, describing half the people who voted for Donald Trump, and I'm not a Donald Trump supporter. She said half of them were a basket of deplorables. And that is stronger language. That's probably, I've not actually looked at the exact figure, but it's about 30 million American people who voted, she finds deplorable. And it is very similar to the language that is used by the Cleggs, the Miliband's, the Rudds, when they're saying what we really need to do is overturn this decision. The people didn't know quite what they were doing when they voted that way. And what it's made me think is I rather naively, when I did the 50 or 60 debates I did before the referendum, mainly in universities, but in trade unions and private companies, all over the country, I thought the arguments about democracy, about having the right to get rid of the people who make the laws if you don't like it, about having the right to choose the people who raise our taxes, I thought it was about democracy. I also incidentally thought it was about the economy. I actually think you're likely to have a better, more powerful economy, and I agree with Ruth, one can be very positive about that. If you make rules that are appropriate to our economy and our culture, it's much more likely to work than if you try to do a lowest common denominator rules across the whole of the European Union. I thought that's what the arguments were about, and I thought we were winning. I now realise that these are really cultural wars, or culture wars. That those people who have manned and womaned our quangos, who have, whoever was voted in, found their positions within the European Commission or somewhere in the European Parliament and the proportional representation systems or around the Palace of Westminster, who always thought they were going to have jobs, and the basis for doing that was that they thought they knew better how to run the country than the people who had the vote. Then those people have had a big shock and they're fighting back. One of the arguments, and I'll come back to this at the end, that is put, it was put last week in the House of Commons, and no doubt will be put tomorrow afternoon in the House of Commons. There's what we were fighting for during the referendum was parliamentary democracy, and that this has been denied to us. Well, I'm in favour of parliamentary democracy. as I've said, I'm in favour of a slightly different form of parliamentary democracy without the House of Lords. But actually, what I thought we were fighting for is where I started, for independence, not for a particular constitutional arrangement between the lower and upper chambers and the sovereign. That wasn't part of the debate. It was the right for this country to decide exactly what constitutional arrangements we wanted to have and what laws we would want to have. Those people who want to stop Brexit have tried to change that argument so that they will have the power within the House of Commons and the unelected House of Lords to stop Brexit. And when I see people, and it doesn't matter who, some of my colleagues, some of my Labour colleagues, some of the Conservative colleagues, but mainly Labour colleagues, who happily voted for the unamendable Lisbon Treaty that passed power over to the European Union, to the Commission, to the Council of Ministers, and gave them the power via passerelle clauses to pass our laws without even consulting us. When those people stand up and say the decision of the referendum was an insult and was a threat to parliamentary democracy, then I do remind them, I want to remind them what they did on the Lisbon Treaty, which incidentally, when it was called the European Constitution, the Labour Party in its 2005 manifesto had committed to giving a referendum on, and exactly the same arguments were put as are being put now post-referendum, that the people, I can remember private conversations and public conversations, people would not understand the Lisbon Treaty. It's too complicated. So we could pass power straight over to people in Europe who would know better how to run our country. Sorry, I'm too far away from the microphone. Is that better?
That's closer is better.
Right, I will try and stay close. Right. Is that okay? Yeah. Right, good. The other fundamental issue, and this is an argument that is being used regularly to try and achieve a so-called soft Brexit, is that we need to stay as close as we possibly can to the rules and regulations and laws of the European Union. And actually, as I understood it, the basis for leaving the EU was precisely so we could diverge. And make our own laws and regulations that are appropriate to us. And what that means, of course, is, I don't know what the party political makeup of this audience is, but it means that in this country are those people who want a more free market economy. They can argue for it and win elections. Those of us in the Labour Party who want some state subsidy, who would like a different organisation for our rail system and some of our other monopoly public services, don't have to go to Europe and be told how we could take the railways back into public ownership. We can do it as the people of the United Kingdom decide to do it. And that should be the normal political debate that takes place in any mature modern democracy. And it was the debate that was stopped by being a member of the European Union. It also means that when you have catastrophic legislation, like the Clinical Trials Directive was, it is now being changed. It took 14 years to change the Clinical Trials Directive so that we could test drugs sensibly within the European Union, by which time much of the jobs associated with clinical trials had moved out of the European Union and drugs had failed to be tested. 14 years. No country that cared about those things would allow that to happen. I think those are the big ticket issues, really, the headlines that make me convinced that we have to carry on with this. I just want to spend the last 5 or 6 minutes talking about the parliamentary makeup and what is really going on there. Some of the papers have carried accurate descriptions of what is going on, some less so. The political makeup is complicated, and it's complicated partly by the leadership of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn, when I voted against the Lisbon Treaty, Jeremy and John MacDonald were in the same lobby as Kate Elliott, Frank Field and I and other people. And I have no reason to believe that Jeremy privately has fundamentally changed his view. And it means, in one sense, we have a friend in the leadership there who is resisting the pressure that was put on him from the first day by Hillary Benn, who went to see him and basically said, we're all leaving if you don't agree to campaign for a yes vote within the referendum. And I think whatever politically one may think about Jeremy on this issue, he's had a lifetime of consistency of being opposed to the European Union. The rest of the makeup of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I think it applies similarly to the Conservative Party, is there are quite a lot of don't cares would be unfair. They were quiet, not very committed Remainers who respect the decision, but are, particularly in the Labour Party, are being pushed through lobbies in a way that they don't feel strongly enough to vote against the whip, but they feel slightly uncomfortable about. And you could see that last week on the vote on the EEA, when those of us who have been consistently voting to implement the decision of the referendum were joined by more Labour MPs who had been Remainers, but actually thought that being a member of the EEA was fundamentally against both the Labour Party manifesto and the decision of the referendum. There are some other Remainers who feel quite strongly and who are arguing for what they call a softer Brexit, which means staying in alignment essentially with a lot of the internal market and the customs union regulation. And then there is a hardcore 50, 60, 65, 70 Labour MPs who want to overturn the decision, and they stand up and say it clearly. Again, you can read it in the House of Commons Hansard. I said it last Wednesday. I've no doubt they will say it tomorrow. What has happened over that period, very cleverly, some of the people who really believe that we shouldn't leave have been coming forward with a number of amendments to the bill that we're discussing, which will just transfer all the European law into UK law, and saying we need a meaningful vote. This is where the parliamentary democracy argument comes in. Well, that has been one, in one sense, who could argue for a non-meaningful vote, who could argue for the opposite of that. But actually, the meaningful vote as it is at the present time isn't that meaningful, because if you vote against the treaty, and I think the people who put the amendments down know that, if you vote for no agreement or against the agreement, the Parliament, the British government, is not in charge of the process. The European Union, the European Commission, are actually in charge of Article 50, and at the end of the 2-year process, we leave. So whatever the meaningful vote is, it doesn't matter. I suspect that if there was a decent majority saying that the government had got the negotiations wrong, we'll end up with a different government or a general election. But it wouldn't alter the timetable. Now, I think the next amendment, which we will consider tomorrow, was withdrawn last Wednesday, is the key one. It's down there, and again, people are saying that it's a meaningful vote. What it does is allow the House of Commons, the House of Lords, both are mentioned in the bill, to direct the government in negotiations. Because the European Commission are in control of the Article 50 timetable, and you need 27 other countries to agree to any change, it's unlikely there would be any change unless Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, said that they wanted to change the decision by another referendum. And that is why I am very clear that whatever Dominic Grieve says, the amendment tomorrow that he withdrew last week is a direct attempt to sabotage the process. It's very well camouflaged, but in one sense, if it was just about a meaningful vote, it is no different from the others, but it isn't. It is saying to the European Commission, we will take control of this process, and when we're in control of this process, we will reverse it by either direct resolution or by asking for a second referendum. I don't know what the result will be tomorrow. It looks at the moment, I talked to some of the whips just before I came out, as though there are going to be 12 Conservatives who will vote with the Labour Party and all the other opposition parties for that amendment. If that amendment happens, I have no idea what the Prime Minister of the Government will do, but I do know that if it's carried, what the implications will be. It is designed specifically to end the Brexit process, and I am trying to persuade Labour colleagues, and I hope we will be successful in getting sufficient to get a majority. It will be a small majority if we do it tomorrow, to carry on with the process of getting out of the European Union. But have no doubt that the people voting for that amendment tomorrow are trying to put that process into jeopardy. Can I thank you for inviting me here again. It's great to be amongst friends because, as you said, a lot of the people I meet from government and the House of Commons are people who actually think the government's gone mad by agreeing to implement the decision of the referendum. They haven't gone mad. They're actually doing what any democratic government should do, which is carry out the will of the people. Thank you.